Hello and welcome back to another matchup of the Chinese Duel Commander National Championship that was recently played. We're already at the quarterfinals with the most soul-time matchup that you can currently play in our format. It's Glarb against Tasigur. Tasigur being a card that was rather recently unbanned, I would say. While Glarb is here for quite some time, a control deck that developed over time. A really solid one. Some people claim that it's still the better control option. Today we're here to find out. So, starting with a Tail's End, stifling the fetch land. That is definitely an advantage, not so much against Tasigur, I would say, since you have the Delve ability to reduce the mana cost. Overall, I would say both decks make use of the Jace Demonic Consultation combo. However, Glarb is much better at bringing that down, simply because you have Thought Lash added to the package, which is a tool on its own against aggressive strategies. And also it allows you to basically one card combo in combination with your commander. So you play your commander, you play the Thought Lash, and then you always have access to the top of your library. You can look at it and you can exile cards for as long as you find your Jace, then you draw the Jace, play the Jace, and keep on exiling cards and win off of that. That's something that so far only Glarb can do. I'm personally a big fan of the deck. I think it's quite hard to pilot. There's lots of decision making involved. It's also a very interesting one. Back then we saw combinations featuring a Reanimator game plan. Since you have the Surveil on stick, you can bin some of those creatures. Yeah, overall, quite a versatile commander, I would say, but mostly played in a pure controlish fashion. Not that popular anymore since, as I said, Tasigur is here. By the way, the Glarb player is a Pro Tour participant. So, yeah, he made it to the quarterfinal. That's already, the entire event was already played at a very high level since people had to qualify for that. But now we have the creme de la creme. The Duris is looking at a wash away counterspell, Stern Scolding, and DeLorean revealed. I would say that's quite a good hand against a deck like Glarb. Pretty much comes down to who's going to stick their commander. Glarb, in comparison to Tasigur, is definitely not in favor. I mean, it has Death Touch, but you will always pay 3, 5, 7 mana. The Mistrise Village can be very good. We have to see what Glarb comes up with here. Maybe you can sneak in some of your combo pieces, but as far as I know, apart from the Thought Lash Jace combo, those decks are not filled with too many. And now that I have a look at the list, there is no Reanimator plan featured, so that seems to be nothing that Tasigur has to be afraid of. However, a Cactus Preserve on the other side is definitely a card that one or another should be afraid of. I personally lost quite a few games against that. Whenever Tasigur doesn't do the job, you have this very powerful manland coming down and beating your ass for 6. Let's see. So unfortunately, I did not get to peek at Glarb's hand yet. So I can't quite say what they're planning. One fact about Tasigur that I really like is I love Wilderness Reclamation. I think it's a really cool card. Also because back then, when Martin was still part of the project, if you wonder why Glarb costs 5, that's because he activated the Mistrise Village in order to not be countered by Stern Scolding. But there is an Abrupt Decay. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about, you know. First, most of the interaction that the Zultai package is playing is not the right removal against Tasigur, because Tasigur is relatively high power and toughness. It is CMC 6, so Long Goodbye, Fatal Push, Abrupt Decay, things like this all won't really do the job here, while an Abrupt Decay is a perfect piece of removal against Glarb. And on the long run, you have to deal with the card advantage that Tasigur provides. I mean, technically, Glarb can do that too. You can play the lands from top, you can play cards with CMC4 or more from top, and that happens from time to time. You can even cast free spells if you can pay the additional cost, or the alternate cost rather. But back to Wilderness Reclamation, back then, when Martin was still part of the project, for the very passionate and long-term viewers of this channel, you all know Martin. Back then we brewed a Thrasios Tymna pile with Genesis Storm. So that was actually the first iteration of Genesis Storm before it got banned. And we packed Wilderness Reclamation, and there was another card. I think, I'm not sure of the name, but it's another CMC4 enchantment that would untap all lands and other things in players' upkeeps. It was a symmetrical effect, so it was not as good as Wilderness Reclamation. But the point was to basically, no, let me think about it. I think it was not part of the Genesis Storm deck, because Genesis Storm cares about permanence or non-land permanence. I think it was another deck. Basically, the goal was to go for as much draw value as possible with Thrasios, and while I would say Tazigur's activation is not as good as Thrasios, it's still worth it to have that mana available. Sometimes, you know, with additional graveyard manipulation, like clinging your own things or escaping the Cling to Dust to get rid of spells that you would not like to have back in hand, you can have a useful activation every now and then. But usually it's something that's, you use it when you have the time or the mana for it. It's not a priority in most cases, I would say. In this game, in this particular matchup, can definitely be a thing, but so far players have exchanged resources more or less successfully, I would say. And both on, one is on 20, the other one is on 18 HP. So we are yet far away from either of them winning the game, I would say. But yeah, probably that was to be expected. Glarb is, yeah, I would say as good as Tasigur. I mean, a 2/4 Death Touch is something that you have to respect from a creature-based deck perspective. Then again, due to how the current metagame is structured, there aren't that many creature-based decks. And, you know, the tempo advantage that you get by casting Tasigur for almost always 1 black is huge. Like turn 3, sometimes you have those turn 3 Tasigurs with Fetch into Surveil, into Mental Note, something like this. And then you end up with your commander as well as 2 mana open for interaction, and that's quite good. So we have an Inquisition, which means that we get to peek at Glarb's hand too. Let's see. Murderous Cut, by the way, a really cool card that I love to see. Definitely a good fit here in Glarb. Back then, when the card was printed, it was one of the newly created solid interaction spells. because exiling cards from your graveyard wasn't really a cost. Came with the same set as Treasure Cruise. And Dig Through Time? No, Dig Through Time was Khan's, I guess. Yeah, okay. It's the entire thing was the Khan's block, the standard block. But Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise were eventually banned in Duel Commander. So we have a swamp or island more. Second card was something, and the third card was something too. But you should see the cards here on the right side because I will edit them in later on. Yeah, it's for now I would say it looks like Tasigur has the advantage. Rakshasa's Bargain, for example, another one of those really, really good additions to the Sultai card pool. Obviously also played by Atraxa and sometimes even 5-color decks. Simply because it's a much better Lawrence Ransom or, yeah, these types of effects were available with Fact or Fiction, and there were some other things played back then. 4 mana, scry 2, draw 2, get 2 energy counters and things like this. There's also another one that is Pauper Legal that would also put cards into the graveyard. I think it costs 4 mana. You look at the top 4 cards, and 2 of them are put in the graveyard and 2 in your hand. I cannot recall the name, but I think it has a homunculus on the artwork. Some of you might know. You can definitely write that in the comments. Meanwhile, Tasigur is back on the battlefield. That's a that's a funny life counter. Or I assume it's a life counter. Ah, there was a mana leak, okay. So I don't quite get why mana leak is wasted here, since Tasigur is left with 4 mana anyways. And, you know, you have the Misreized Village in order to stop your opponent from countering Glarb. And yeah, I don't really get that decision here. Maybe he wanted to cut Tasigur off of like some bigger spells. Then again, there is not much with CMC5 or more. And for as long as the activation is still possible, which is the case here. Those are some very good flips, by the way. We have Cling to Dust, Rakshasa's Bargain, and Demonic Tutor. Of course, you have to give the Cling. The other 2 cards are much better. Still, it's a decent card advantage engine, especially in the control mirror. You see that very often, players battling over Clings just to draw more cards. And now Tasigur is here, and Tasigur seems to stick. First swing comes in. Abrupt Decay again dealt with Glarb. It also came back with Tasigur's ability because he milled 2 lands. If I saw that correctly. So now the frog is back, sitting in its throne. Let's see. And getting back the Rakshasa's Bargain because all the other flips. You know, this is another type of situation where, and it happens from time to time, that the flips are really, really good with Tasigur, and it definitely ends up in creating value. If you can, okay, there's Glarb's own Cling to Dust. If you can somewhat get rid of Glarb another time, and they do not provide interaction for Tasigur and the Cactus Preserve, then I think you are in a difficult spot at some point. Because from what I saw, Tasigur seems to aim at winning by combat damage so far. While I think the Glarb player is rather trying to... Oh, Oko hurts. So Oko does result in a 3/3 Glarb without abilities. But it's also... It's interesting that they did not decide to block or trade Tasigur with Glarb, since at that point I think Tasigur would cost 10 and there are only 2 or 3 cards in the graveyard, which means they have to pay at least 7 to recast it. And now they're very far away from blocking it, or at least trading. Here we have a Tamiyo. Tamiyo is kind of cool, a bit late honestly, and especially in the face of Oko, not too crazy anymore, but seems to be worth the Tail's End. Yeah, okay, I can see that. In addition to the Ponder, maybe if there's like another draw spell, would have flipped Tamiyo immediately. And then Oko is not able to elk it anymore. Still nothing that for now provides infinite value, I would say. There's currently a lot of pressure on Glarb finding something to win the game with, I would say. And that's, I guess that's an advantage if we're talking about the Reanimator splashing strategies. Then again, in the current metagame, I can totally see why people would not do that. I feel like with decks like Tasigur and Terra and Emry, and with Controlius in the format, there is so much pressure on graveyards that I would also stick to the control plan exclusively. So, another flip. There's a Cryptic Jay's Subtlety, Rakshasa's Consult. And I think the last one is a land. That's incredible. No, yeah, Otawara, okay. That's just whatever you give back to your opponent, it's just a good spell that you basically don't want to give back. Oh, never mind. Sorry, it was a Thoughtseize resolved. I thought it was like a Tasigur activation. Never mind. So the Subtlety got discarded. And here's the long goodbye for Oko. Rakshasa's Bargain returned to hand again. And this card on its own, one card has drawn 4 cards already. And as we know, a control mirror is a fight of resources, rather an exchange, and who has the more resources will likely win the game. And that is the case here. So we see a bounce and an activation of the Cactus Preserve, and that should be it. That's 10 damage. Yeah, and we have a direct concession going over to game 2. Preordain is mental misstepped. Okay. Yeah. Maybe the idea behind was that Glarb might have kept a hand that is based on cantrips providing some value in order to balance out the land drops. And since there is not that much that Glarb can provide at CMC1, I mean, it could be a wash away you can counter with the mental misstep. That's definitely a worthy target. But things like, I talked about it earlier, things like Fatal Push, Requiting Hacks, etc., those are all cards that you are likely not going to cast against Tasigur. Here we have a Sheoldred's Edict in a very cool new Mystical Archive appearance. Creeping Tarpit. I think that's a card that we don't see too often, unless I'm not sure if Askeladden plays it in his list. But usually, since you have all the surveillance and you have the Cactus Preserve, and some lists even play like the slow fetch lands, you have lots of tap lands. So you don't restrict yourself to too many of those effects. And Creeping Tarpit, yeah, I would say 5 years ago, this was still a very good man land. These days, 3 mana, dealing 3 damage, even if it's unblockable, is kind of cute. It dies to a shock. So, I don't know. If we compare it to the Cactus Preserve. Cactus Preserve costs 3 mana as well. Yeah, so the Cactus Preserve is much better. Here we have a Barrogoyf. Late. But the subtlety is trying to deny that. There's likely... Okay, there's no counterspell coming down. And now we have a red on the board that can deal some damage. If it sticks, and that seems to be the case for the first attack. Another one of those cards that you can't get rid of with Long Goodbye, Abrupt Decay whatsoever, right? It's usually the plan of tempo decks to bring down a target and protect it. I'm surprised there was no counterspell and also no interaction for the subtlety. But, you know, sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. And now you can just tank on that flying 3/3 and, yeah, probably try to win the game with it. Still have the Creeping Tarpit if needed. At some point you will have a Tasigur cast. So I think the pressure that Tasigur can provide here is much better than Glarb. Let's see. Another Barrogoyf cast, which will be destroyed by, I think that's a Go for the Throat. Some Secret Layer stuff. These days it's crazy. There are so many different artworks. And even if you see all of those artworks, it's hard to remember. It challenges all our visual memory that is very important in Magic the Gathering, because this is the way that we recognize effects and texts on cards and stuff like that. But yeah, luckily you can write down things if you get to look at your opponent's hands. So, what is happening? The card beneath Subtlety is likely going to present the ring, which means even if Glarb would provide a flying blocker would have to have 3 or less power in order to be blocked. Apart from that, maybe there's like a Murktide coming around that could not block it if the Preordain would be exiled. But apart from that, I think it's not too relevant. And here we have Tasigur. Coming down for 1 again. The Rakshas's Bargain is here. Again, providing value. Glarb being cast for 5 feels awkward in this situation. But also it seems to be necessary. So, cast the Bargain. Fire Nation Occupation is in Tasigur's graveyard. That's sad. That would be a card that could win the game on its own, as it's always the case with this card. Extremely powerful. Was also interesting. This card was pretty much a sleeper, I would say, until a French player from Strasbourg played it in one of their heyday control lists. And all of a sudden people realized, well, this card is absolutely crazy, and we should probably play it in all the black control decks there are. And here we are. Especially, yeah, I mean, whenever you play counterspells, this card is just really, really good. And most of your interaction suit will be at instant speed anyways. Here we have Long Goodbye, Cut Down, and the Oculus. And the Oculus is likely going to be discarded since we have exactly that case I was talking about earlier. Having two of those removal spells in hand that are completely useless against this deck. This is the first of, yeah, this kind, this matchup. I haven't seen Glarb against Tasigur so far. Based on the facts that were seen, it seems that Tasigur is favored. Then again, I think, yeah, it's hard to say which deck has or provides like more value towards the late game. Probably Glarb. But whenever you don't hit a land or a CMC4 spell, and the deck is not like filled with 30 CMC4 spells or even higher costs in order to, you know, make maximum use of Glarb, that's not the goal here. But if you have like a reliable number on top every now and then, should help. Then again, as we saw in game 1, the Tasigur flips can be devastating. Oh, that's the cool Aether Drift Forest. And here we have a Thought Lash, which is likely going to be countered. Yeah, and with the interaction with the Long Goodbye and the Cut Down, you can't really do anything else, which means now that Glarb is tapped, this should be GG. If no, it is not. Never mind. I mean, you can activate the Creeping Tar Pit, but since there is the Long Goodbye and the Cut Down, you have to give it another turn in order to beat your opponent down with those two creatures. And now that Thought Lash is gone, even in exile, there's not much to fear. I mean, there could be something from top. There could be a Jace coming, randomly drawing a Tainted Pact or a Consultation, and you expect your opponent to not have anything. That's, I don't know, a very romantic thought, if you ask me. So, Undercity Zero comes down. Another Glarb cast, and that's it. There's the handshake. And it was a really cool game. Congrats to Tasigur. Interesting dynamic. I would be curious to hear from you if you have any stakes in this matchup. If you have any experience, let me know in the comments. We can discuss a little bit about that. Apart from that, thanks a lot for tuning in, and we will see each other in the next match. Bye-bye.